Pod SaaS, where we're putting the SaaS back in sassy. Sponsored by LeadrPro, where you can book demos with target customers on demand and fill your sales pipeline instantly.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Pod SaaS. I'm your host, Chris Sheng. Today we're joined by Luke from Centercode. How are you doing, Luke?
Excellent, sir.
Awesome. Where are you coming to us from?
Orange County, California, Laguna area.
Oh, nice. That's a beautiful area. It's not too far from us. We're in Santa Monica.
Not at all.
Yeah, especially today. It's we were just talking about it, but it's one of the hotter days from the week so far. It seems like, and it seems like we're going through like this weird shift too, where it's like plus or minus 20 degrees like any few random days for whatever reason.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago we had a 60-degree delta between the evening and the morning.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, if people aren't aware of climate change, I mean, I think we're seeing the ramifications of some of that now. In any regard, why don't you, before we're going to get into our rapid fire questions and we get to know you and your entrepreneurial journey, I would love to know a little bit more about what Centercode is, what you guys do, what makes a great ideal customer for you guys too.
Sure. So the short version is that we provide a platform primarily to tech companies, more often than not larger tech companies, that helps them engage with their customers to build a better product and bring something more successful to market than they otherwise would. If you think of sort of the traditional idea of beta testing, we're more or less a next generation idea of that leans heavily on a very concrete process and a framework, and then technology to automate as much of that process as possible. So most of our customer base are kind of the who's who of technology, names Sure. that you recognize. And we basically facilitate that relationship between them and their customers to collaborate and ultimately build something that works better for everybody.
Yeah, so it's automating a lot of that feedback loop from existing users or customers, and then bringing that back to help them prioritize kind of product roadmap or what that might look like.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Is there a certain like stage of company where that becomes like extremely useful? Because I'm assuming, a lot of like the earlier stage companies, like that's really not in their mindset yet. Yeah, maybe they had some validation or proof points in doing some kind of like research, but getting the product out is like, or an MVP of the product to a certain degree is the most important thing. But like, when does those iterations or that speed to those iterations become really important from some of these companies that you guys have worked with?
So what we've come to recognize somewhat recently, actually, is that our sort of dream ideal customer traditionally has been a company that's about 5 to 10 years old. And what that means is they've matured to the degree where there's a material need here. They've recognized it. They've had probably some bad launches, and they see the need to sort of centralize this into something that they'll build a team around. So if you look at the Pelotons and Zooms and Rokus of the world, they have teams dedicated to this that live on our infrastructure, on our platform to run the show. Companies younger than that haven't quite got there yet often, unless they've poached someone from one of those more mature companies, which we do see. Any company that we have that is very early, say 50 employees or less, typically saw that need immediately and hired someone who's already used our platform or already sort of understands that world. And that's something that they're very product and customer centric from almost day one. If they're a product-led company from day one, they'll get that idea. What's also interesting is the companies that are over 10 years old, which do make up a good chunk of our customer base, but it took a while to build it. Those are companies that grew up in the pre-Agile era. And to them, that product testing was very episodic. Every 18 months, they'd put out a new product. They'd run a test for that product. They'd have to learn everything that one time, and they'd forget it by the time they did it again. Yep. And therefore, it was never centralized. It was individual product managers kind of fending for themselves. And therefore, they're just not attuned to the idea of continuous release, which again, that one sweet spot of anybody who grew up in Agile is. So most of our names that you'd recognize are of that kind of that sweet spot of tech that they recently became a household name in the last few years. And now everybody knows about them. But 10 years ago, nobody knew who Roku or Peloton were. Yep. Now they're everywhere. Where we are shifting our market a little bit is we've got a new version of our product, which is a much more prescriptive approach aimed at an audience that is a decentralized group. So again, if you look at a company like Sonos or iRobot, they have teams that do this. And our product was frankly designed traditionally for those teams. It was a big infrastructure for an enterprise company. What we're now offering is a product that is geared toward a part-time user who is going to really rely on automation and a more prescriptive path to getting their feedback and getting it prioritized. And they don't need it to be centralized. So it's much cheaper to get in the door, and it scales with them, as opposed to needing to lay down kind of that traditional sales-led model. This is more of that PLG approach to the world. Got it. Very interesting. Very cool. I can see a lot of the guests that we've had on here probably find use in it. So makes a ton of sense. Great. Yeah, before we kind of dive into your journey to becoming the CEO of Centercode, it seems like Centercode's been around for a while, and you've been at the company for a while, also previously as a CTO. Is that my understanding? Yes, true. Great. Yeah, so you're part of I was just talking to a few other people that earlier this week, where you're part of a rare group of individuals that go from the technical side into the CEO role, because and it's not a very common thing. The other guy that ended up becoming the CEO of a unicorn at this point, but he spent 7 years in a sales role, coming from a CTO type of role, to kind of learn. His idea was he needed to have that skill set in order for somebody to consider him as a CEO. So I'm just curious to how your journey ended up in there. But yeah, we'll dive into that in a second. But that's one of the things I was thinking about as I was kind of perusing through your LinkedIn profile. I was oh, that's interesting. It's something that we were just talking about. Cool. Before I hop into that, love to just jump into these series of rapid fire questions. It's nothing too personal, but it's just a good way for us to get to know you. Any questions around that before we jump in, or are you good? No, man, I'm an open book, so cool. happy to do it. Easy enough. Awesome. First question is really easy, straightforward, but do you have a favorite entrepreneur and or a possible favorite startup story? I do, and I've actually got a couple, and it's a little bit cheating because they're people that I became close friends with over time. Sure. And eventually convinced them both to join my board. So they're two people that I'm very close to and serve as mentors. I feel like you can only learn so much through the lens of the third party stories. Yeah. So, quite honestly, my two favorites are personal friends. One of them is a guy that I almost guarantee you've never heard of, because he's really made it a habit to keep a low profile. But his name's Mark Tofig. He started a data center business, pretty basic, but quite some time ago, and he sold it just before the original .com crash. So he got out at the absolute height. He bought it back a couple years later once everything crashed, for less than a tenth of what he sold it for. And it came with something like a 50,000 square foot facility in Irvine here, which is incredibly expensive property. Yeah. And then he continued to build it for another 5 or 6 years, and he sold it for something like 6 or 7 times what that first exit was. Wow. And, at this point he's living in a $50-ish million house in Laguna, and currently visiting the brand new house he just built during COVID in Japan. Nice. And he couldn't be more humble. He couldn't be more down to earth. And he and I have become great friends over time. And I just respect the hell out of him. He's a really good guy. The other one, and they really are sort of equals in my eyes, is someone who's a little bit more well-known in certain circles. His name's David Perry. And he started a number of very prolific gaming companies, sort of early in gaming. He started a company called Shiny at one point. And ultimately, the biggest thing he's known for at this point was he created a gaming streaming service called Gaikai. And he exited pre-revenue to Sony for $400 or $500 million. Just did a great job, and it became a product called PlayStation Now. And, meeting him is funny because we were, in the same area. And one day we got set up by one of my salespeople actually to have lunch. And it just so happened that the restaurant we had lunch at, there was a freak weather storm and there was a flash flood. And we got stuck at this little CPK for 8 hours. Our cars were flooded into the parking lot and we couldn't leave. And in those 8 hours, we just frankly learned how much we had in common, got along, and, kept in touch, and eventually got closer and closer, pulled him onto my board. And he now has another company called Viral, which is awesome. And he's just a great guy who, he's on my board, and every board meeting, he is the guy that just wants to talk about everything that is possible in any context and just dreams big. He's one of those people that there's no point in thinking about a sub-billion-dollar exit.
Yeah.
He's already done the $500 million exit, so the next one has to be bigger, and he wants everybody in his circle to be thinking the same. So it's very motivating. It's really good.
Very cool. Those are great examples for sure. Next question is going back to your childhood. Do you remember as a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, what you wanted to be? And I obviously, granted, you have a pretty strong tech background, so I'm not sure if that stems from a passion that existed.
Yeah, it started very, very early in terms of, what I originally wanted to be was a programmer.
Okay.
I liked the Nintendo as a kid. That was kind of my inspiration. And I wanted to make games. And, I was getting magazines and typing, basic code from a magazine page into my Commodore 64, which, was an incredible thing for that age. And, what was interesting about kind of where my childhood went is on one hand, I loved the idea of tech and creation and the sort of rapid nature of software. At the same time, and this is sort of very key to who I am and where I went, I don't have a lot of patience as a human being. I just don't. I really want things to work. And I was the kid who always got called to fix every printer, to fix every network, to fix every, computer. And I didn't have patience for it. It wasn't where I was having fun. I wanted to be creating. So there was this confluence of those two things early in my career where I realized I could sort of have my cake and eat it too. I could build something, but that something could help make technology better. Mm-hmm. And I would achieve both at once. And that really turned into a career for me.
Got it. So very early on, you already knew that you wanted to do this, but there's like two paths of like either educating people about what you know or building something that is going to maybe like change the way that something's done, and you're trying to see how you could bridge those two worlds together.
Yeah. And to be honest, there was actually two paths. That was one. My other passion throughout my entire life was on the sort of pro audio and music production side. My first actual job was being the only white kid in a hip hop studio. And like I was, their token diversity hire. And I learned to use, production equipment and do some basic engineering, and I loved it. My first interview that I got an offer for was actually at a company called Interplay, which, funny enough, David Perry, my example there, sold a company to. And it was to do music for video games, which was kind of the dream. But the problem was, if I took that job, I frankly wouldn't have been able to afford rent. It wasn't an industry that paid. So, within a week, I had two offers, one to go into true tech, working for what became Samsung, the other to be in Interplay, a video game company that went out of business shortly after. I think I ultimately took the right role, but I really loved that side of creation as well. And what I eventually realized is that some of those creative things, if you turn them into work, they will be work and you will burn the creative side of you. And I think I got the best out of both worlds by choosing the path I did and still being able to create and have fun on the side.
Yeah, for sure. Which I think is super important. I mean, this is actually one of our questions, but is that something that you do to decompress, like going back to music or creating in music or production of music?
Very recently, yes, actually. So the funny thing is I worked in that industry a bit. I worked on some sort of open source projects and whatnot early. I really enjoyed that space. And when it faded when I started my company, and the reality was I was, working 14, 16 hours a day. I wasn't doing anything for fun. I then got married and had, shortly after, my first of two children. And at that point, I actually made a conscious decision, as weird as it sounds, to not touch music anymore. I just realized that with the bandwidth of my life, I wasn't going to get the enjoyment out of it if I couldn't put sincere time into it. I just didn't have sincere time. And at this point, my kids are now 10 and 12, and frankly, I have no interest in me most of the time. So I've started rebuilding a bit of a music studio at home, and it's interesting the way life works in that, theoretically, I could frankly afford to build it, in a day.
Sure.
But I will stare at a piece of equipment, online and go into over-analysis paralysis for like 3 months before I'll make the call. And, my wife would push me to buy it all and get out of the way, but I still feel amazing every time I get a new piece of equipment to explore. Yeah. I bought something I'm very excited about yesterday. These are the toys that as a kid, I could never have afforded. I worked at a music studio to be able to touch them. And that was amazing. To be able to have a room dedicated to them at home is a whole different world. So yeah, now in the last few months, it's been helping me decompress. It helped me really get through COVID because I was there 24 hours a day to be able to do something different. Yeah. And I'm really enjoying it. It's awesome.
And what kind of music is that you gravitate towards?
Mostly electronic stuff of basically any subgenre. I'm constantly just exploring and having fun with anything electronic. I'll do some orchestral stuff just to keep sharp, but other than that, it's pretty much just playing with synths and samplers and going nuts with that. So I did work early in my career for a company called Native Instruments, which is coincidentally a customer of ours today. And they were kind of one of my first loves of software synthesis and whatnot. So I've kind of been, now acquiring their stuff and others and having a good time with it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I do think that, and a lot of the guests have spoken to some of these different hobbies and interests. I mean, it's super important. I think like it's equally important as like meditation or taking time out for yourself in the more traditional ways, for soothing or alleviating like mental health, especially given the burnout that can happen. Working from home now, like the lines are so blurred, right? So it's like you could be obsessing about something, and even though you're not in front of your computer and like logging hours necessarily, it could be occupying your mental bandwidth. And it's really important to, I feel like, find these things that either as kids we've had a lot of passion towards, or something we put onto the back burner to exercise those muscles and kind of give us a little sense of pause from the day-to-days.
Yeah, and for me it was that, and then the other one, which is just classic for my era, is to this day I still love video games. Awesome. I played Nintendo as a kid, and I buy every console that comes out, whether or not I have the time to play it. Love them to death. I still have a good time, and I've still got a nice community of friends there that we've all kind of grown up together playing. So it's still, I would say that's my true deflation of I don't even have the energy to be creative. Yeah. That's where I'll go next.
Yep. Where you can just kind of like tune out, just relax. Don't have to think about anything else. Got it. Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Next question that I have here is the idea, it comes around the idea of like growth. So personal, professional growth. And the question is, what's one of your most painful experiences that you can recall? And this can be personal or professional, but okay, context wise, right? Like you tend to grow from these like crazy, uncomfortable situations, right? That weren't great at the time, but you can see it now.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stories, and it's all true. When I first started this company, when I first had the idea, I had been with a girl for about 2 years, and relationship getting more serious. Had a good job, everything was great, and I had this idea, and coincidentally, it was time to meet her parents. They lived in Northern California, tip of Northern California. We needed to fly up there and introduce the boyfriend. So when we went up there, I introduced her dad to the idea. He did the typical, what are you doing with your life story? And I told him the idea, and he fell in love with it. He thought it was great. And he offered to move me and the two sort of partners that I was working on with it up there, and that he would fund our lifestyle, and that we would all live up there, and he would pay for it. And I was in. That sounded amazing. I convinced my two cohorts to do it with me, two friends, Nathan and Neil. And I convinced her pretty easily, frankly, to move up there and get this done. So we all packed up our stuff, we quit our jobs, and we moved to the very tip of Northern California. And that sounds way cooler than it is. Yeah. Where we lived was a place that, frankly, no one's ever heard of, called Crescent City. It was about 5 miles from the Oregon border. Okay. It's not the Palo Alto, San Jose, San Francisco. Yeah. And just to give you some context, and this really does set the stage for the story, it was the worst place in the world. There is one sort of form of industry up there, and it's Pelican Bay State Prison, which is the most maximum security prison in California. It's basically exclusively reserved for rapists and predators and mass murderers, and it's just it's terrible, right? But there's a lot of them, it turns out, and when you have that many in one place, the only sort of demographic that lives up there in this city of like 5,000 people is a few thousand prison guards and a few thousand families of lifers. And if you imagine a community of people that have less interest in each other, it would be pretty extreme. So basically it was this Twin Peaks environment that was terrible. Well, anyway, We moved up there. We didn't know that part when we moved there. I will point out the funny thing is that's all kind of behind the scenes. It is also the most beautiful place I've ever been, and by far the most beautiful place I've ever lived. We had a redwood tree in our front yard, and we were 500 feet from the water in 3 directions.
Wow.
It should have been a clue that the house, this 3-bedroom, 2-story house, cost $40,000, but on the beach basically. But we didn't catch that. So the crazy part of the story is we all, got our stuff, moved up, rented a U-Haul, moved like 800 or 900 miles, whatever it was. The day after we got there, not exaggerating, literally the day after we got there, my girlfriend of 2 years says, "Hey, can we go for a drive?" I said, "Sure." We get in the car and she says, "This relationship just isn't working out for me."
Wow.
And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she's like, I'm not happy. I didn't want to be this close to my parents. I've kind of realized that now. I'm just not happy. I think we should break up. And I'm sitting here going like, I took my 2 closest friends and we moved like 900 miles yesterday. And she's like, "Yeah, I understand, but I'm not happy." And we broke up and we slept on opposite sides of the bed for the next 6 months. We had no other options.
Yeah.
And every single night, I am not exaggerating, every single night I would walk to the ocean. I would scream at the ocean for 15 minutes. And then I would walk home and start over. And it took me about 6 months to say, fuck this, I'm out. And we all went back and I got people their jobs back and we kind of, reset. And it was at that point that created an opportunity to try again with one additional co-founder who was kind of the missing piece. And the second time it worked out, but it was absolutely miserable. Everything about it was terrible. And I'm weirdly glad to have done it. It's a great story in hindsight. It's funny, we pull up in Google Maps and we literally can't find where we lived. Like our brains have blocked it. It was so miserable. But it happened. So yeah,
wow,
that's by far the worst story.
And that's the second iteration is Centercode. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Interesting journey. So yes, I would say that you probably learned a lot from that painful experience. I mean, obviously, to the point is that whatever 20 years later, right? It's still in existence. It's become successful, and you're I mean you've grown it to where it is today. So I think everything happens for a reason. You never know, right? Like if everything went swimmingly fine and you guys stayed together, would Centercode end up being where it is today? Who knows, right? Like if you didn't go back down, find that additional 4th co-founder.
And in hindsight, even with her, not dumping me, it wouldn't have worked. We were 3 engineers with very similar mindset.
Yeah.
I was definitely more of a product-minded engineer, and the other 2 were more of your classic engineer. Both of them are still with us today. One of them took on CTO, one of them's running an engineering team. I mean, they're still, we're still very close. Just had lunch with one of them, but it was bringing in a co-founder with more of a business attitude and frankly, some gray hair. When we started this company, we were very, very young, did it at the wrong time for lots of reasons, but bringing in an adult to help round us out was phenomenal. And even he stayed with us until somewhat recently. We lost him to cancer a couple of years ago, but had we not lost him, I'm very confident we would have all 4 been together today. It's been a great ride.
That's awesome. That's great. Sorry to hear about that loss, but at the same time, I mean, pivotal, I'm sure, to have been able to meet him, bring him in at the same time and get you guys to where you are. That said, is there anything, particularly that motivates you in that 25th hour? Like, obviously now maybe it is like going back and listening to those words of that 4th co-founder or, but maybe like even earlier before then, anything particularly?
I've been thinking about this a lot lately for a variety of reasons. I've been just kind of rethinking about the state of the world and a lot of messaging to my company and whatnot. And, the funny thing about what motivates me is it's never changed. I at home have a nice TV set up in our room that I have done everything I can to make it as solid and simple as possible. And still, half the time I try to do something, the sound bar is out of whack or the Apple TV is not turning on or whatever else. And literally, and I'm not exaggerating, every single time something doesn't work, I get pissed off. And then I realize I can have an impact on this. And I have, to some degree, had an impact on this, that the halo effect of the companies we've reached and the thousands of products has made a difference. And there are many products in my household that we touched. That TV doesn't happen to be one of them. I get frustrated easily because I see the potential.
Yeah.
I think that technology should reduce friction. It should increase our quality of life. It should increase our reach. And I just think so often it's not doing that well. And the TV not working is a dumb, simple example. It's just a very tangible one you get kind of in your own room every night. But it applies to everything. And I love the idea that we can remove that friction and make these things more useful so that everybody achieves more. That's the goal.
Yeah. I mean, when you say something like that, though, like I also think about human relationships, right? It's like, if there was only something that could do the same thing for human relationships, which is like take the communication patterns that we go to, like through an emotional level, but then like reduce it to like, what is the common issue here? And then having that sense of logic to work your way through it, that would be amazing. But I mean, I get it totally on the product front, because we all encounter that, as consumers, right? Different types of friction or pain points, and it's not unique to us, right? It's like we're going through it. It excites us. It makes us feel some kind of emotional, trigger or whatever it might be, like towards that, tangible product. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of other people going through something similar. So be able to funnel that back up seems like a very, very useful tool. Cool. Another quick question here is that you talked about you're going from a CTO role to a CEO role, and that is a very different transition, right? Like a different type of role. Buck stops with you. You're responsible for a lot more things. And has there been anything, wearing a lot of different hats in that role, anything that you've either loved or hated, have a strong emotional disposition towards, that as you stepped into that position?
Yeah, at this point, I've run nearly every group at the company at some point in our growth cycle as we were, looking for a leader or something. The only group I've never really run and don't have a lot of success with is the actual sort of finance org itself. My original CEO was traditionally kind of a COO finance background, CFO finance background. So when we played a little bit of musical chairs halfway through our journey, I took over CEO, he took over CFO. So through our entire existence, I've never had to worry about that. And I've always been pretty disconnected from it. More recently, as we've grown and had a lot more mouths to feed, the area that I was starting to dislike, and this is actually pre-COVID by probably a year or so, was just HR and everything that surrounded it. It just felt like there was so much friction involved and impracticality around everything. And I was just getting more and more frustrated with it. And it was actually, there was a big moment where I was at lunch with another CEO, and CEOs love to go to lunch and whine to each other about how terrible our lives are. And I was whining to him about something, and it had to do with like law changes that were impacting us, but not designed for us. And this happens a lot. Like they'll change some labor law relative to some big industry that is completely irrelevant to you, but you still have to change the way you do things and explore and invest and pay for lawyers and just things that are annoying when you just want to get shit done. And I was whining about it. And he said, look, man, his name was Ike. He runs a company called Fsoft, super cool dude. He said, look, man, you need to treat your company like a product, and you need to design it. And you need to think about it the way you think about product, because I don't really think of my background so much as engineering. That was my early career, but I couldn't do my CTO's job at this scale today, but I'm still very involved in the product. I still design and lead the roadmap, and I'm very involved. I live in Figma. I love it. It is my happiest place. But I just hated that HR idea until he said that, and just something clicked. And I started thinking about my employees as my customers and designing a company that they wanted to be a part of. We've always taken people and sort of the relationship with our employees very seriously. We don't think of them as expendable by any means. You just can't in our space. But it gave me a framework to start thinking about how we measure performance and how we think about performance and how we reward it and how we get ahead of things. And it just completely changed the company. It really did. And I have an incredible HR gal now who's kind of grown up here with that mindset with me. and I can lean on her for a lot of things, and we're very aligned. And it's been really good. I hated the HR side of the business until that moment. And now, as we grow, and I think about bringing in new people to take on things that I have to do, because that's how this works. When you're an entrepreneur, you're really doing 10 jobs.
Yeah.
Then you hire, 10 people eventually to do them, and keep expanding that idea. So I'm constantly thinking about who I'm hiring next to take away a piece of my job, and which part of my job I want to give away, what I'm good at, what I'm not good at. And it's interesting now, like if I were to go back 3 years, I think I would be incredibly surprised that I would never want to give up that people side of the business, and being very close to kind of HR and how we think about, why people want to work here, especially in this new world, the new sort of COVID thing, remote. I'm at my office, as I told you, that I haven't used in 2 years because we are fully remote. We gave everybody the option to come back, and almost nobody did. So we then took advantage and started hiring people everywhere. And we went from being in one state to 14 states in the course of a year. So, I've loved, honestly, thinking about that and game playing out how that works, and how we kind of get ahead of this and take advantage of it. So it's fun. I like that part.
Awesome. Very cool. A couple of questions here, before we kind of round things out, but one of them, this is a little bit more personal question, but is there any item on your bucket list that you consider fairly ambitious?
That's actually a pretty great question. I do. One thing that I struggle with, I will admit, is the exit and what comes next. I constantly have people asking me kind of what the next idea is. And the reality is I don't have one yet. I have a million ideas to take this company forward and continue to grow it. But we do, at this point, we started out bootstrapped. Eventually we brought in investment. I do want to return that investment to them, obviously, as well as my team. So eventually I'm going to have to exit, and I want to exit big, obviously. But it's hard to figure out exactly what I want that to look like, because this, even if we exit, whether or not I leave is the big question mark. There's basically one or two companies in the world that I could see working for as, a contributor. Otherwise, I'd have to go do this again. And I think if I do that, I'm going to automatically be in Dave Perry's space of, okay, I did big, now I have to do bigger. Something about me that I've figured out is I don't actually have a desire to be a leader. I don't want to be a boss, first of all. I find almost no interest in it. I like designing systems to get people excited about the company, but I'm not looking to be in a power position. I have a company because I wanted to achieve something much bigger than I could do on my own. And to me, that's a very meaningful way to look at a business you're passionate about. Is it's not about I need people who report to me and say, yes, sir. It's not how we operate. I just want to achieve something big. So, for me, it's a hard thing to answer with a very specific answer, because I just want technology to be useful. I want it to not be frustrating. I want it to make life better. I want it to continue to do that. I want to defeat sort of solutionism and the gold rush idea behind technology just being a way to make money. I think it should be, the next step in our evolution. And I just want to be as big a part of that as possible. But I don't care to be known to be a big part of that. I want to do it for my own sort of personal ambition. I don't really have anything to achieve beyond that.
Got it. That does lead to the next question, though. But the final question here, which is the idea of legacy. But in more context, it's what's the impact that you want to leave on this world? And I think you kind of alluded to it, before you leave it, right? But it's the idea of like it seems, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from what you're kind of just talking about, it's like the idea of making technology as frictionless as possible. So I don't know if that's kind of what you would say now.
Unfortunately, you kind of stole my thunder, which I guess I already gave you. I guess the only difference is when you're running a business, you have to focus on feeding the team and growing and making a lot of decisions relative to that. I guess the next sort of stage would be able to do the same thing, but pick and choose the categories and the types of products that we could have a bigger impact on, because we do have to deal with some level of solutionism and just a product that we know doesn't really solve real problems, doesn't really move the world forward, we're happy to help. It's someone's ambition, but everything comes down to opportunity cost and how much bandwidth we have. Yeah. And it would be wonderful to be able to focus on the most impactful products that truly are the best for the world. But yeah, at the end of the day, I want my children to grow up in a world where technology is taking them much, 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 much further than we can really imagine today. Yeah. And that's where it's going. That's where I want it to see, but I want it to be good for the world. And you know, sometimes I wonder if tech is good at all. Other times I couldn't be prouder to be in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a fine line sometimes. Very cool. That's it for the rapid fire questions. But but I definitely want to dive more into, you know, going from the first pass at Centercode, you know, at your ex-girlfriend's parents' house up at the border of California and Oregon, you know, and then how did you guys actually come up with the idea in that first iteration, right? And how far away is that idea from then the second pass at it? If you can walk us through kind of what that looked like.
Absolutely. So I ran a web team at a large company called Ericsson, huge telecom tech company. And a product manager came to me and said, "Hey, I need you to run a beta test for our product." And I said, "Okay, what does that mean?" And he said, "Oh, I need you to get some customers together and give." And I was like, "No, I understand what a beta is, but what does that mean in the context of Ericsson? How do we do that?" Mm-hmm. And his answer was, "We don't have a process for that." And I didn't believe him at first. I legitimately threw at him like, "Hey man, I have a 4-inch guide for how to use the logo. There's no chance this 100,000 person, 100-year-old tech company doesn't have this figured out." And he's like, "Look, man, if you can find a process, use it. Otherwise, just figure it out." I said, "Okay." I dug in for a process. There was nothing. I dug into my network. There was nothing. And I found one company out there that offered it. And I frankly didn't like their solution. I didn't like their approach. I didn't like their attitude. And it clicked. I had recently, within the couple of years before that, fallen in love with what was a new industry at the time, or a new concept of usability. Usability, and Jacob Neeson and people like that were kind of the new idea at the time. And the idea was no different than what we've talked about today, is technology should be friendly. It should be useful. And this is going back, 20-ish years, and it's novel to think about it, but technology was for technical people mostly back then. And if you weren't in that group, in that mindset, then it wasn't for you. And I didn't get that. I didn't understand that. Having grown up a child in it, you have a very different perspective. So for me, I had fallen in love with usability, which sort of evolved and migrated into thinking about user experience and whatnot. And I saw this gap in the market, and I light bulbs went off, and it was like, okay, I can take my love of making things more useful and better and removing friction, and I can apply it to a business that I can drive and have a huge impact. And what I was really thinking about at the time was, I can continue to work for big tech companies, and I'm confident that I can get a great job at virtually any tech company I wanted. And it wasn't because I was brilliant. Frankly, it was because I was the right place at the right time. I walked into the industry when there just was not enough people who cared about it and knew what it was, and tech was young. So I saw the opportunity. The first time, as we've already said, I brought in 2 engineers. Eventually, I got someone a little more useful. But the difference was non-existent. What we wanted to do the first time, what we ultimately did was the same. And ironically, it has literally been 20 years. And what we produce today is, frankly, closer to the original vision than all the time in between, where we had to make a lot of concessions and sell to different audiences and kind of roll with the punches of the market and the economy and so on. And ironically, today, what we're putting to market, especially being able to reach smaller and a much smaller companies in a much bigger market, that's what we wanted to do originally. The original idea was that we were going to put together a platform that small companies would license on a monthly basis or subscribe to online, cloud before there was cloud, SaaS before there was SaaS, and it was aimed at small companies. And there was 3 reasons that we thought small companies would make sense. 1, we were literally all sharing one apartment and didn't have an office and didn't think anyone would give us the time of day. 2, there was one competitor in the space, and they had raised a bunch of money before the dot-com crash. We were smart enough to start this like a month after the dot-com crash. And 3, we knew that because we were bootstrapping, we wouldn't have a deep feature set that would appeal to an enterprise. It was going to take some time. So for those reasons, my early young business mind thought, hey, we'll go after a small market. Now, I didn't realize the challenges of that at the time, but that was the idea. The first company to ever buy our software and call us was actually Sun Microsystems.
Wow. Okay.
They were a huge company at the time, and they, pulled up the shitty website that I threw together while we were building the product, and they wanted in. And I brought an adult onto the phone, somebody that had spent 30 years at IBM in a sales role, because we were going to have our first conversation with a big customer, and I wanted someone who wasn't 20-year-old me talking on this call. So this is the first call. I did not expect it was going to go deep. And I spent the first 10 minutes trying to talk them out of any interest. When they wanted it, I told them, well, it's not done yet. And their response was, well, that's great. We can influence their roadmap. We can help shape it to our needs. And I just objected to everything, and they pushed back. And keep in mind, I'm thinking this tool is going to cost a couple $100 a month tops to small businesses, small product development companies. And I am not shitting you. This is exactly how this call went. They got past all my objections, and they said, okay, what does it cost? And I didn't speak. This other guy that I brought in, Scott, he spoke up, and he said, well, it's $300,000 and $60,000 a year in perpetuity for support. And I shit you not, their answer was, okay, that sounds reasonable. And there was never any negotiation, and that is what they paid.
Yeah.
And that was it. That was our first funding.
Off to the races.
And sorry, what?
Off to the races.
Exactly. That was where it went. And there's a much longer story here, and it's something that I think other entrepreneurs could really learn from, to where on one hand, that was amazing. And anybody who is currently looking for their first win would think that's the best thing ever. And it was. I mean, it paid for a lot. The problem was it gave us an invalid view of where the market really was.
Yeah.
Because once we sold that, we assumed that was the market. That's what the market will bear, right? And we actually grew slow for a few years, despite being bootstrapped and lots of other challenges, in part because we got hooked on that deal.
Yep.
And we did sell more of those. We sold to Adobe next. We sold to Symantec. We sold to all names you'd know, but we're selling 1 or 2 a year, growing somewhat slowly on it. And the reality was those companies were ahead of the curve. Mm-hmm. They had already centralized these testing teams because they had such a big offering, and they were already moving into Agile very early. In Sun's example, they were building Solaris, an operating system. That's something that is consistently iterated on. Ericsson didn't have a process because, like I explained early on, this was something they did every 18 months. Yep. Different people did it. It was completely spread out. Sun had gotten ahead of that, centralized it. Adobe had centralized it. Symantec had centralized it. These were very mature tech companies that saw the problem, but they were way ahead of the curve, and we were way too early to market. Now, far more companies have centralized it because Agile became a thing, but we were half a decade plus before Agile. So, we were very early to market, got hooked on that model, and couldn't get off it once you're hooked on it. So. Sure. One company isn't the market. 2 companies isn't the market. You have to be a little open-minded and think about it. But we were so afraid of cannibalization that we weren't willing to change our mind. So that's basically how it formed. And the other thing that we did was early on before the platform, we sold managed services. We would run beta tests for other companies.
Got it. Okay.
And we did that specifically because the product wasn't done. And we could use it successfully in an incomplete state far sooner than we could hand it to a customer. But this is actually, I've come to learn, another common problem is that you get hooked on that revenue. Yep. And it's not the high enterprise value, the 10x, 20x return that SaaS will give you, but it is alluring. And there's always a market for it. There's always, especially in a down economy, there's always a market for not adding headcount. And only this year did we actually separate from that business. In January, I split that off as a separate business unit. And I put the proclamation to my team, we are not accepting new service business. We're pure SaaS now. That service business will continue to exist and we will maintain those logos. We have an incredible book of business of amazing customers there. We didn't lay anyone off. We kept the whole team. Everybody's engaged, but we split the company so that we can focus the front end of the company on SaaS and then maintain the service business purely as an ongoing funding source for the broader business.
Yeah.
But it was a big decision to do that. And it took a lot of time and convincing to make it happen.
Got it. And so would you say, like, from that time period when you started to onboard these really large logos to then getting to more of a, I think maybe a true semblance of market fit where you actually saw, where as a scalable market exists, when did that happen?
So the interesting thing there is, it's funny. We have a weird history because we have existed for a long time and we were very, very, very young when we started this. And ultimately, I attribute the first decade being very slow growth for a number of reasons. We were inexperienced, we were bootstrapped, we were far too early to market. And that's the interesting one is I think we were, and I was talking to someone about this yesterday about how, like, I'm really not bragging, but we were ahead of the curve on everything to a fault.
Yeah.
We saw PLG early, we saw SaaS early, we saw continuous development early. The problem is we were so early, we just sat treading water until the market caught up.
Yeah.
So I would say it was in the last 5-6 years that we were now at the right place, right time, and that we were still trying to do the same thing and promoting and prophesizing this is the way it should be done. And now the world is waking up on its own because of the challenges of building more complex, more interconnected, and more iterative technology. Those three things together basically pushed the world toward us. And because we had sort of persevered through so much, we were at the right place in the right time. So it really was just the world caught up to what we've been screaming about for a very long time. Sure. And, we built a successful boutique business where we were personally making good money. We owned 100% of it. Everything was great. And when I became CEO is when I said, no, I want it to be bigger. I want to do something bigger. I want to have a bigger impact. Someday we want to exit. I don't want a family business. I don't want a casual lifestyle business. And that was when I better aligned with the market. I took on some funding sort of serendipitously, did a lot of things that really changed the outcome of the company. And that was all about putting me as a leader in place who was just more ambitious. Whereas, I had that product-centric mentality. My previous CEO was a finance guy. He was naturally incredibly conservative, especially coming from a bootstrap company. So it required putting someone who was a lot more ambitious and willing to take risks than someone who really had that fiscal background. That was the big shift there.
And when did that happen?
Around 2010, I would say somewhere around there.
Got it.
And that in itself was a story. And the short version of it is I had just turned 30 and we had raised capital. Not really capital. We'd taken a loan from some very high net worth friends, and it was $1 million loan, and it was on a 3 or so year term, and that term came up. And I guess this was 2009 now, because the economy had absolutely crashed. And all of a sudden we owed $1 million to a couple high net worth people, and we didn't have it. The economy had crashed. We had about $250,000 in cash, and it wasn't going to happen. So they got angry. They basically got angry, and really it's a longer story, but the short version is my co-founder, my previous CEO, had decided to move to Austin during our early years. And these guys that loaned us this money were older gentlemen who didn't take kindly to that. They looked at it as he was leaving the shop. The reality was he sold a home for $1 million here, which sounds cute now, but it was a big deal then, and bought a home twice the size in Austin for $300K. And just ran the show remotely. It wasn't a big deal to us, but they didn't look at it that way. So when we couldn't pay back this loan, they looked at it as an opportunity to jump in and basically destroy the company. I invited them to breakfast. They had always had faith in me as kind of the whiz kid. I was 20 when I met them. I invited them to breakfast and said, look, there is an opportunity here. Please do not take away my baby. What can we do? And their answer after a very long, contentious breakfast was, if you will take over CEO, we will reestablish the loan and we'll reset the terms and you can pay us off over the next 3 years. So when I turned 30, I inherited $1 million in debt on my ass.
Yeah.
I got married. I had my daughter. Wow. And I became CEO all within that year. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure my blood pressure freaking exploded. Yeah. And I did it. I paid off their loan on time perfectly over the course of 3 years. Formed an incredible relationship with them, actually. They turned around completely, and we're still all close to this day. And at that point, we owned the whole company again. Again, it was just a loan, and I was magically thrown into the CEO seat. It turned out to be a good thing, and my co-founder, the CFO, liked it. He was a good 25 years my senior, always looked at me as kind of the son he never had. So this was really handing the keys to the kingdom. Very positive thing. He moved into CFO. Everybody, won. And as I said, we kept him until we lost him to cancer, but otherwise he'd still be my CFO today, guaranteed. Got
it. Awesome. That's some great stories in there, in all of those experiences. We're rounding up on the hour here, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but usually my last question is the idea of like, where do you foresee yourself in the next 5 years? And I think we already kind of covered that, in terms of the idea of an exit, right? And so instead of asking that question, I'm just going to ask you more of, for those founders out there, for people who have started companies that are in their, third, fourth, fifth, sixth year, and seeing that slow growth, maybe feeling that burn of like, we're just really early to market. How did you persevere? Any advice of like, how do you keep it going? Because I do hear this time and time again, where it's just like, you just need to outlast everybody, right? Like, it's not like necessarily that having a great idea, having a great work ethic is obviously super important, but a lot of the times it's just like the stones to outlast everybody else. And it seems like you guys kind of did that, right? It could have been very easy to just been like, hey, the market's not there, going to walk away from it. But you had that foresight collectively as a unit to kind of like stomach it and continue down that path. Curious to any thoughts on it.
I'll happily give out my email and have this conversation with anyone that wants to have it. But I have been the entire time addicted to this company. There is no other. It's funny, but as I mentioned, my hobby is gaming and music. And I have had offers to take on significant positions in virtually every gaming company that I love. I've had Valve try to get me to go there. I've Riot Games, Blizzard back when they weren't horrible, all of these opportunities. And I've never really considered one seriously to any degree. It was never an option not to do it. It's kind of crazy. I love the idea of what we do. And that's something that I definitely tell a lot of entrepreneurs too. I think those that kind of burn out on their idea were never really bought into it from the beginning. I never wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to accomplish something specific, and being an entrepreneur was the obvious path to get there. I think people should go out and solve problems they care about. And if they don't care enough about it, I don't think they'll stick to it. I think they'll fall off when times get tough. And we have had real tough times. I mean, we've definitely had those times, but I never considered leaving. I get annoyed when I get an offer to leave because it sounds fun in some respects, but it could never stack up to what this is, even when it sucks. So I think the trick is just make sure that you are passionate about the problem you're solving. Make sure you're solving a problem. And I think it's easy to stick. It really is. Yeah.
And to think it all stemmed from what, you're pre-20 working at Ericsson and having no playbook for how to run the process.
I literally a product manager who I'm having dinner with later this week, came to me with a problem, and it was not my domain to solve it. He just looked at me as, a resource. And fate took its place. And I'm very proud of what we've done. I'm proud of what we're doing. It's a lot of fun.
On that note, thanks so much for joining us, Luke. Super excited to kind of see where you guys are in the next few years here. And definitely we'll share Centercode to all the viewers, as well as like the other past guests that have been on here that could definitely find use in your solution. So,
like I said, happy to talk to anybody. Love helping out in the space. I'm always a good shoulder to cry on. I've been through a lot. So awesome. Don't hesitate to reach out. Luke at centercode.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Luke.
Thank you.